Hi, welcome to the Silent Avenger channel. If you're enjoying the content, please consider giving it a like and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Let's dive into today's story. My name's Joe, I'm 42, and I've spent most of my adult life climbing the corporate ladder. I'm the CFO and COO of my family's business, a company I've helped expand into a national success. But I guess none of that matters now, because last week, I found out my entire life has been a lie. I'll start with my wife, Carol. We've been married for 19 years, or at least I thought we were. She's smart, beautiful, and always had this sharp wit about her that I admired. I thought we were happy. Sure, we had our ups and downs, but who doesn't? Then there's my brother, Eric. Growing up, we were close. He was the charming one, always making everyone laugh at family gatherings, but he had a knack for stirring up trouble too. Even so, I trusted him completely. He was my best man at my wedding. I never thought he'd stab me in the back. It all started with an email. I was reviewing some financial reports late at night when I came across an odd expense tied to Eric's department. At first, I thought it was just poor bookkeeping, but when I dug deeper, I found some discrepancies. This was unusual, even for Eric, who's always been a bit of a risk-taker in business. The next day, I confronted him about it, and he laughed it off, saying I was overthinking. But something about his reaction didn't sit right with me. That's when I decided to dig deeper, not just into the finances, but into everything. It took a few weeks, but the pieces started falling into place. Late-night meetings between Carol and Eric. Cryptic messages on her phone. And then the nail in the coffin, a paternity test I found buried in old family records, showing that Sam, my 17-year-old son, isn't biologically mine. He's Eric's. You ever have one of those moments where the ground feels like it's been ripped out from under you? That's how I felt. I confronted Carol first. She tried to deny it, but when I showed her the evidence, she broke down, screaming that she didn't mean for me to find out this way. She kept saying, "It's not what you think," but when I demanded the truth, she confessed everything. 17 years of betrayal. It turns out, my parents had orchestrated the entire thing. They believed I couldn't have kids because of some baseless assumption about my infertility. Instead of talking to me, they decided Eric should step in, to keep the Tyndall bloodline alive, as if I wasn't part of it. Carol went along with it because she didn't want to lose me. She swore she loved me, but I couldn't hear anything past the roaring in my ears. I haven't even gotten to my parents yet. When I confronted them, they didn't deny it. My mother had the audacity to tell me it was for the best, and that they never thought I'd find out. My father just sat there silently, staring at the floor. No apologies, no remorse, just excuses about how it was a family decision. As for Eric, he smirked when I brought it up, like this was some twisted game he'd won. He actually said, "Well, Joe, it's not like you ever would have found out if you'd stayed in your lane." That was the moment I knew I couldn't let this slide. Not only had they betrayed me, but they also humiliated me. My own son, my world, wasn't even mine, and everyone in my family knew except me. There's so much more to this, but I need to stop here for now. I can barely sleep, and when I do, all I see is their faces. I don't know how to move forward, but I do know one thing: they're going to regret ever underestimating me. After the initial shock wore off, I realized I had two choices: sit in my misery or take action. If there's one thing I've learned as a CFO, it's that emotions don't solve problems. Planning does. And if my family wanted to play dirty, I could do that too. The first thing I did was move out of the house. I told Carol I needed space, but let's be honest, I couldn't stand to be around her. She begged me to stay, saying she'd do anything to fix things. "We can go to therapy," she kept repeating, "but what's the point of therapy when the foundation of your marriage is a lie?" I told her we were done, packed a bag, and checked into a hotel. Sam, my son. God, even writing that feels weird now. He called me that night, confused and upset. Carol must have told him something because he kept asking why I wasn't coming home. I couldn't bring myself to tell him the truth. Not yet. He's a good kid, and none of this is his fault. I just said I needed time. While Carol spiraled, I started digging into Eric's side of things. That odd expense I found in the company's books? It turned out to be just the tip of the iceberg. Over the years, Eric had been funneling money into some shady side businesses, a failed real estate deal, a questionable investment in some tech startup, and God knows what else. He'd been covering his tracks well enough that no one noticed. Well, no one but me. I didn't confront him right away. Instead, I compiled everything: bank statements, contracts, emails. I wanted a solid case before I made my move. Meanwhile, I had to deal with my parents. I met with them one evening at their house, determined to get answers. My mother started with her usual condescending tone, saying, "Joe, you have to understand," but I cut her off. I told her I didn't care about her justifications. I wanted to know why. Why didn't you trust me enough to talk to me? Why go behind my back like this? Her answer? You were always so busy with work. We didn't want to burden you with something this personal. Burden me? With the truth about my own life? My father chimed in then, saying, "We thought it was the best solution." Eric was willing, and Carol agreed. We never thought it would blow up like this. That's when I lost it. I told them they were selfish cowards, hiding behind family loyalty, while destroying the very meaning of it. My father sat there, stone-faced, but my mother started crying, as if she were the victim here. "You've ruined everything," I said before walking out. That night, I started laying the groundwork for my revenge. My first step? Securing my position at the company. Eric might have thought he was untouchable, but I had the leverage now. I set up a meeting with our legal team, disguised as a routine financial review. By the end of it, I had access to documents that would let me expose Eric's mismanagement without implicating myself. And then there was Carol. I couldn't just let her off the hook. I reached out to a divorce attorney, a shark, the kind who makes opposing counsel cry. We started drafting papers, but I wasn't ready to file just yet. I wanted to hit her where it hurt first. To be honest, the hardest part in all this was Sam. He kept texting me, asking if we could talk, and every time, my heart broke a little more. I wanted to tell him I still loved him, that he was still my son, but I didn't know how to say it without breaking his world apart too. For now, I've kept my distance. It's cruel, I know, but I need to play this smart. Because once I make my move, there's no going back. This is only the beginning. Over the next week, things started to unravel for Eric, though he didn't know it yet. I kept my head down at work, playing the part of the overburdened COO while quietly building my case. I was careful not to raise suspicion. If anyone asked, I told them I was staying at a hotel because I was focusing on a new project. Technically not a lie, though the project was dismantling Eric's life. But, of course, Carol couldn't leave me alone. She called constantly, left messages about how she was so sorry and couldn't lose me. Her favorite line was, "Joe, we can fix this. I love you." That one made me laugh every time. How do you fix 17 years of lies? Then she tried showing up at my office. I saw her in the lobby through the glass doors, pacing nervously, holding a stack of papers. I had my assistant tell her I was in meetings all day. Whatever she wanted to say, I wasn't interested. Later, she texted me pictures of old cards I'd written her over the years, anniversary notes, birthday messages, even a cheesy one I'd made for her when we were first dating. She was clearly trying to manipulate me into remembering the good times. I didn't respond. The tipping point came when she emailed me. It was a long rambling message about how she never meant to hurt me, and that the affair with Eric wasn't really an affair. Apparently, in her twisted mind, sleeping with my brother was a family duty, not a betrayal. She wrote that she only went along with it because my parents pressured her, and she didn't want to jeopardize the family legacy. Here's the kicker. She ended the email by saying, "But you're still Sam's real father in every way that matters." That one stung. As much as I wanted to hate her, part of me wanted to believe that. Part of me wanted to hold on to the idea that Sam was still mine, that the bond we'd built wasn't a lie too. But then I thought about all the times I saw Eric and Carol whispering at family events, how she always seemed to have his back when I criticized him, and the way they both downplayed my suspicions over the years. It wasn't just about Sam, it was about the years of deceit, the way they'd made a fool out of me while pretending everything was fine. So I made my next move. First, I quietly froze all non-essential spending in Eric's department. Nothing major, just enough to slow him down and make him sweat. Then, I sent an anonymous tip to the company's board, flagging some of the discrepancies I'd found in his financial records. Within days, whispers started circulating about Eric's questionable leadership. He started holding frantic meetings, trying to calm everyone down. He even came to my office, pretending to ask for advice, like we were still on the same team. "What's going on, Joe?" he asked, leaning against my desk like we were buddies. I've been hearing some rumors. I looked him dead in the eye and said, maybe you should be more careful with your decisions, Eric. People talk. The color drained from his face. He knew I was onto him. Meanwhile, I moved forward with my divorce plans. My lawyer was a bulldog, and we were gathering everything we needed to make sure I came out on top. I didn't want Carol to walk away with a dime more than she deserved. As for Sam, I finally decided it was time to see him. I couldn't avoid him forever. He deserved answers, even if they weren't the ones he wanted to hear. We met at a diner near his school. He looked nervous when he saw me, probably because I'd been so distant lately. As soon as he sat down, he asked, "Dad, did I do something wrong?" That shattered me. I told him no, that none of this was his fault, and I was sorry if I'd made him feel like it was. He nodded, but didn't look convinced. "Then what's going on?" he asked. "Why did you leave? Why won't you talk to Mom?" I couldn't tell him everything. Not yet. So I said the only thing I could: sometimes, grown-ups make mistakes, and it takes time to figure out how to fix them. It wasn't the answer he wanted, but he didn't press further. We ate in silence for a while, and before we left, I told him, "No matter what happens, I'll always be here for you." I hope that was enough. This whole situation feels like walking on a tightrope. One wrong step, and everything could come crashing down. But I'm getting closer to the endgame now, and I'll be damned if I let them win. A week after I spoke with Sam, things really started heating up at work. The board launched a formal investigation into Eric's department, citing financial irregularities as the reason. Of course, I had quietly fueled that fire, providing the legal team with every questionable transaction I'd uncovered. I kept my distance from the investigation, pretending to be just as surprised as everyone else. Eric, on the other hand, was in full-blown panic mode. He started calling emergency meetings, sending out frantic emails, and doing whatever he could to plug the holes. I overheard him arguing with one of his managers, blaming them for the discrepancies. Classic Eric, always quick to throw someone else under the bus. But the best part? Carol. She showed up at the office again, this time storming past my assistant and barging into my office. "What the hell are you doing, Joe?" she snapped, slamming the door behind her. I stayed seated, calm as ever. "I'm working, Carol. Something you'd know nothing about." Her face turned red, but she didn't back down. "Don't play dumb with me. I know you're trying to destroy Eric. This isn't you. You're not a vindictive person." I raised an eyebrow. "And what exactly am I supposed to be, Carol? Forgiving? Understanding? Maybe I should just pretend everything's fine, like you did for the last 17 years. That shut her up for a moment. She folded her arms and tried a different tactic. "This is going to tear the family apart, Joe. You're better than this." I stood up, walking around my desk to face her. "Don't you dare talk to me about family, Carol. You and Eric burned that bridge the moment you decided my feelings didn't matter. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have actual work to do." She stormed out, muttering something about how I was throwing away everything we built. I didn't care. Whatever guilt she thought I'd feel was buried under years of betrayal. Meanwhile, I kept an eye on Sam. He'd been quieter than usual, which worried me. I wasn't sure if Carol had told him anything yet, but I knew it was only a matter of time before he started asking harder questions. Sure enough, a few days later, he called me again. "Dad, I need to ask you something," he said, his voice tense. "What's on your mind?" I replied, bracing myself. "Is there something you're not telling me?" he asked. "Mom's been acting weird. She keeps saying we should stick together as a family, but she won't tell me why. And you've been distant. It's like something happened, but no one's telling me what." I sighed, knowing I couldn't dodge the truth forever. "Sam, there's a lot going on right now. Things between your mom and me. They're complicated." "Complicated how?" he pressed. "Are you getting divorced?" The word hit me like a punch to the gut, but I didn't flinch. "We might be," I said carefully. "But that doesn't change how much I love you." There was a long pause before he finally said, "I just want things to go back to normal." "I know, buddy," I said. "I do too." After he hung up, I sat in my car for what felt like an hour, staring at the dashboard. The truth was, nothing would ever be normal again. The next day, the investigation into Eric reached a boiling point. The board called an emergency meeting and suspended him pending further review. Eric tried to spin it as a misunderstanding, but the evidence was overwhelming. When they asked for my opinion, I gave a carefully worded response, saying I trusted the board to make the right decision. That evening, Eric called me, furious. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" he spat over the phone. "I know you're behind this, Joe." I leaned back in my chair, letting his words roll off me. "Behind what, Eric? Your own incompetence? You did this to yourself. You're going to regret this," he snarled. "You're tearing this family apart." I couldn't help but laugh. "Funny, I thought you and Carol handled that years ago." He hung up after that, and I knew the gloves were off. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about taking back my life, piece by piece, and making sure they felt every bit of the pain they'd caused me. And I wasn't done yet. The fallout from Eric's suspension hit the family like a wrecking ball. My parents called an emergency family meeting to talk things out. It was the kind of thing they'd always done when Eric screwed up: drag everyone into a room, sweep his mistakes under the rug, and pretend everything was fine. This time, I wasn't playing along. The meeting was at my parents' house, and the tension was thick as I walked in. My mother looked like she'd been crying, while my father sat stiffly in his chair, avoiding eye contact. Eric was already there, pacing like a caged animal. And of course, Carol was sitting next to him, looking guilty as hell. When I walked in, Eric immediately started his tirade. "So this is your big plan, Joe? Destroying your own family just to make yourself feel better?" I didn't even bother sitting down. "You did this to yourself, Eric. Don't blame me because you're finally facing the consequences of your actions." My mother jumped in, her voice shaking. "Joe, this isn't who you are. You're letting anger cloud your judgment." I snapped my head toward her. "No, Mom. What clouded my judgment was trusting all of you. 17 years of lies, and you're still trying to make this about me being angry? You don't get to lecture me on morality." My father cleared his throat, finally speaking up. "Enough. We need to find a way to move forward." "Move forward?" I said, incredulous. "There's no moving forward from this. Eric stole from the company, you covered for him, and Carol." I stopped, glaring at her. "Carol destroyed any chance we had at a real marriage. So no, Dad. There's no moving forward." Eric stepped closer, pointing a finger at me. "You're acting like a child. All this because you can't handle the truth? You've always been self-righteous, Joe. Always had to be the golden boy, the one who does everything right. Well, newsflash, no one's perfect." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my composure. "This isn't about perfection, Eric. It's about betrayal. You slept with my wife. You stole from the company. You lied to my face for years. And now you want sympathy." He sneered. "You're just jealous because I gave the family what you couldn't." The room went silent. My mother gasped, and my father muttered, "Eric, that's enough." But I wasn't shocked. I'd been waiting for him to say something like that, and I was ready. "Jealous?" I said, my voice icy. "You think I'm jealous of you? Of what, Eric? Your lies? Your failures? Your pathetic attempts to make yourself feel superior? The only thing I regret is trusting you." Eric opened his mouth to respond, but my father cut him off. "That's enough from both of you. Joe, what do you want? What will it take to put this behind us?" I stared at him, amazed that he could still be trying to negotiate like this was some business deal. "What do I want? I want accountability. I want Eric out of the company. I want Carol to sign the divorce papers without dragging this out. And I want the truth for once." Carol finally spoke, her voice trembling. "Joe, I never wanted to hurt you. You have to believe that." I looked at her, feeling nothing but disgust. "It doesn't matter what you wanted, Carol. You made your choices, and now you'll live with them." She started crying, but I didn't care. I turned to my parents. "If you think I'm going to let this go, you don't know me at all. This isn't just about Eric or Carol. This is about how all of you treated me like I didn't matter, like my life was just a piece on your chessboard. That ends now." With that, I walked out, leaving them to stew in their guilt. After the meeting, I went home to my hotel room, exhausted but determined. I poured myself a drink and stared at the city skyline, thinking about everything I'd lost. Then my phone buzzed. It was a message from Sam. "Can we talk? Mom's been acting weird, and I'm really confused." I texted back, "Of course. Tomorrow after school." He agreed, and I spent the rest of the night preparing myself for the conversation. I knew it was time to tell him the truth, at least some of it. This isn't just about revenge anymore. It's about setting things right, even if it means tearing apart everything I once held dear. The next afternoon, I met Sam at the park. It was his favorite spot when he was a kid, and part of me hoped it would help soften the blow of what I was about to say. He was already sitting on a bench when I arrived, looking nervous. I grabbed us some sodas from a nearby stand and sat down next to him, unsure how to begin. "Thanks for meeting me," I said, handing him a drink. Sam shrugged. I need to know what's going on. Mom's been acting weird, and you've been avoiding me. I feel like something's being kept from me, and it's freaking me out." I nodded slowly, trying to find the right words. "You're right, Sam. There is something going on. But I want you to know, no matter what, I love you. That hasn't changed, and it never will." His eyes widened, and he shifted uncomfortably. "What do you mean? Are you and Mom getting divorced?" I exhaled, my chest tightening. "Yes, we are. But there's more to it than that." He stared at me, his jaw tightening. "What else?" This was the moment I'd been dreading, but I couldn't keep lying to him. He deserved the truth. "Sam, this is hard to say, but I found out recently that, biologically, I'm not your father." For a second, he just blinked at me like he hadn't heard right. "What?" I could see the confusion and disbelief on his face, and it killed me. "Your Uncle Eric. He's your biological father. I didn't know until recently. Your mom and Eric, they had an affair, and it's been going on for a long time." Sam's face turned pale, and he stood up abruptly, pacing in front of me. "No. That can't be true. You're lying." "I wish I was," I said quietly. "But it's the truth. I've seen the proof." He stopped pacing and looked at me, tears welling in his eyes. "Why would Mom do this? Why would Uncle Eric? I don't understand." I stood up and put a hand on his shoulder, but he pulled away. "I don't understand it either, Sam. But I need you to know that none of this changes how I feel about you. You're still my son. You'll always be my son." He shook his head, his voice cracking. "You don't get it. My whole life, everything's a lie. How could she do this to us?" I didn't have an answer. All I could do was stand there as he tried to process the impossible. After a few minutes, he sat back down, burying his face in his hands. "I don't want to go home," he muttered. "You don't have to," I said. "You can stay with me for as long as you need." He didn't answer, but the way he nodded slightly told me he'd heard. That night, Sam stayed at my hotel room. He barely spoke, barely ate, and I didn't push him. He needed time, just like I did when I first found out. As much as it hurt to see him like that, it also solidified my resolve. This wasn't just about revenge anymore, it was about protecting him from the people who had betrayed us both. The next day, I filed the divorce papers. Carol tried calling me repeatedly, but I ignored her. Sam didn't want to go home, and I wasn't about to force him. He needed stability now, and I was determined to give him that, even if everything else in our lives was falling apart. At work, Eric's suspension had turned into a full-blown scandal. The board was preparing to terminate him, and rumors were swirling about the financial mismanagement. I made sure to stay in the background, letting the evidence speak for itself. But the satisfaction I felt watching him squirm was short-lived. Because now, more than ever, I knew this wasn't just about taking down Eric or cutting ties with Carol. It was about building something new for myself and for Sam, a life where we didn't have to live under the shadow of their lies. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was moving forward. But I also knew the battle wasn't over yet. There was still so much to unravel, so many wounds that needed healing. And as I looked at Sam sleeping on the hotel couch that night, I silently promised him one thing: I wouldn't let them destroy us. Not now. Not ever. The days after Sam learned the truth were heavy, like a fog hanging over everything. He stayed with me in the hotel, barely saying a word, and I let him have his space. I could tell he was trying to process it all, but what do you even do with something like that? Every time I tried to bring up school or his friends, he'd just shrug or mumble something about not wanting to deal with it. Carol called non-stop, leaving messages begging me to come home, or at least bring Sam back. "You can't just keep him from me, Joe," she said in one voicemail, her voice trembling like she was on the verge of tears. "I'm his mother. He needs his family right now." That one really pissed me off. The nerve of her to play the concerned mother after all this? I didn't call her back. Then Eric tried calling. Twice. I didn't pick up. The second time, he left a voicemail, his voice dripping with fake calm. Joe, we need to talk. You can't let your anger tear the family apart. I get that you're upset, but you need to think about what's best for everyone, especially Sam. Hearing him say Sam's name like he had some right to him, I almost threw my phone across the room. That night, Sam finally spoke up. We were sitting on the couch, watching some old action movie, though neither of us was really paying attention. Out of nowhere, he said, "Do you think I'll turn out like him?" It caught me off guard. What do you mean? I asked, muting the TV. Eric, he said, his voice low. Do you think I'll end up like him? A liar, a cheat. Someone who just uses people. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. No. Not a chance. You're nothing like him, Sam. You're kind, honest, and you care about people. You're my son, and I know the kind of person you are. He looked at me, his eyes red. But I'm his too. Doesn't that mean something? Like, maybe it's in my blood. Blood doesn't define who you are, I said firmly. Your choices do. And you've always chosen to be a good person. That's what matters. He didn't say anything after that, but I could tell my words hit home. The next day, I made an appointment with a therapist for him. He didn't argue, just nodded when I suggested it. I knew he was carrying a lot, and as much as I wanted to fix everything for him, this was one thing I couldn't do on my own. Meanwhile, Eric's situation at work reached a breaking point. The board officially fired him, citing gross misconduct and financial improprieties. Word spread quickly, and by the end of the day, the company was buzzing with gossip. Eric showed up at my office that evening, looking furious. He didn't even knock, just barged in and slammed the door behind him. This is on you, he shouted, jabbing a finger in my direction. You think you've won? You think you're some hero for tearing me down? You're pathetic, Joe. I stayed seated, leaning back in my chair. I didn't have to tear you down, Eric. You did that all on your own. You don't get it, he snapped. You're destroying the family. Sam, Mom, Dad, do you think they'll ever forgive you for this? I stood up slowly, keeping my voice calm. Forgive me? For what? For uncovering the truth? For holding you accountable? Don't try to make this about me, Eric. You've been lying and cheating your way through life for years. This is the result of your choices, not mine. He stepped closer, his jaw tight. You think you're better than me, don't you? Always have. But guess what? You're not. You're just a bitter, self-righteous fool who can't handle the truth. I stared him down, not flinching. You're right about one thing, Eric. I can't handle lies. That's why I'm done with all of you. You, Carol, Mom, Dad. You're toxic, and I'm not letting you drag me down anymore. He laughed bitterly, shaking his head. You're going to end up alone, Joe. Mark my words. Better alone than surrounded by traitors, I shot back. He stormed out after that, slamming the door so hard the glass rattled. I sat back down, my heart pounding. Part of me wanted to chase after him, to say everything I'd been holding back for years. But it wouldn't have mattered. People like Eric don't listen, they just manipulate and deflect. When I got back to the hotel that night, I found Sam asleep on the couch, clutching the blanket I'd given him. For a moment, I just stood there, watching him. He looked so young, so vulnerable. And for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope. I'd lost so much, but I hadn't lost him. Not completely. And as long as I had Sam, I still had something worth fighting for. The fallout from Eric's firing sent shockwaves through the family. My parents, ever loyal to their golden child, called me in a panic. My mother begged me to reconsider, saying Eric deserved another chance. He's your brother, Joe. Family is family. We can't let this divide us, she pleaded. I told her the same thing I'd been saying for weeks. Family doesn't lie, cheat, and betray each other, Mom. If you want to stand by Eric, that's your choice, but don't expect me to. She cried, of course. My mother always had a way of making herself the victim in every situation. My father didn't say much, just the occasional, think about what you're doing, before sighing heavily, like I was the one tearing the family apart. But none of that compared to Carol's next move. I came back to the hotel one evening to find her waiting in the lobby. She was dressed up, her makeup flawless, like she was trying to remind me of the woman I fell in love with all those years ago. For a moment, I hesitated. She looked different. Vulnerable, maybe. But then I remembered everything she'd done, and the sympathy evaporated. "Joe," she said softly, standing as I approached. "Can we talk? Please." I stared at her for a moment before nodding toward the hotel cafe. "Fine. But make it quick." We sat at a small table in the corner. She folded her hands neatly, her engagement ring still shining on her finger. I noticed she hadn't taken it off, and for some reason, that annoyed me. "I know you hate me," she began, her voice trembling. "And I don't blame you. I made mistakes, horrible ones, but I never stopped loving you." I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. "You have a funny way of showing it, Carol." She flinched but pressed on. "I know there's nothing I can say to undo what I've done, but I'm begging you to think about Sam. He needs both of us. He needs his family." That word, family, hit me like a slap in the face. "You really think you can talk to me about family? After everything you and Eric did?" "I didn't want to do it," she blurted out, tears spilling over. "Your parents, they pressured me. They said you couldn't have kids, that it was the only way to keep the family intact. I was young, Joe. I was scared. I didn't know how to say no." I laughed bitterly. "So you just went along with it? For 17 years? Don't insult my intelligence, Carol. You had every opportunity to come clean, but you didn't. You chose to keep lying." She reached across the table, trying to grab my hand, but I pulled away. "I didn't want to lose you," she whispered. "I didn't want Sam to grow up without a father." "That's the problem, Carol," I said coldly. "You didn't just lie to me, you robbed me of my life. You let me believe in something that was never real. And now you want me to just forgive you because you were scared? No. I deserve better than that." She broke down then, sobbing into her hands. People in the cafe started glancing over, but I didn't care. Let them look. Let them see what betrayal looks like. After a few minutes, she looked up, her mascara smudged and her eyes red. "What about Sam?" she asked. "You can hate me, but don't take him away from me. Please." I stared at her, my anger simmering just below the surface. "I would never take Sam from you, Carol. But don't think for a second that I'll let you use him as leverage. He knows the truth now. He's not a little kid anymore, and he'll make his own choices." She nodded, wiping her face with a napkin. "I just want to fix this," she whispered. "I don't care what happens to me, I just want to make things right for him." I stood up, tossing some cash on the table for the drinks we hadn't touched. "It's too late for that, Carol. You should have thought about making things right 17 years ago." As I walked away, I could hear her crying again, but I didn't turn back. When I got back to the room, Sam was sitting on the bed, scrolling through his phone. He looked up when I came in and asked, "Was that Mom downstairs?" I nodded, tossing my jacket over a chair. "Yeah." She wanted to talk. He hesitated, then said, "What did she say?" "She wants to fix things," I said, sitting on the edge of the bed. "She's worried about you." Sam scoffed, looking down at his phone. "Now she's worried about me? Funny how that works." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just sat there in silence. After a while, Sam said, "I don't think I can ever forgive her." "You don't have to," I said quietly. "Not now, not ever. That's your decision to make. Just, don't let the anger eat you up. It's not worth it." He nodded, but I could tell he wasn't ready to let it go. Neither was I, if I was being honest. But for the first time, I felt like we were on the same page. This wasn't going to be easy, for either of us, but at least we had each other. And for now, that was enough. After the confrontation with Carol, I realized something. She wasn't the enemy I needed to focus on. As much as her betrayal cut me to my core, Eric had been the puppet master in all of this. He'd been the one to step in, the one to benefit the most from my parents' ridiculous scheme. And while Carol was out there crying and trying to save face, Eric was still walking around like he was untouchable. That needed to change. Word of Eric's firing spread fast. His reputation in the industry was in shambles, and he'd been scrambling to salvage what he could. I knew he'd land on his feet. People like Eric always do, but I wasn't going to give him that chance. I started reaching out to some of our competitors, subtly planting seeds about Eric's track record. I didn't have to say much. The details from the investigation were already circulating. I just made sure the right people heard the right things. I wasn't trying to ruin his career outright, just make sure no one trusted him with anything meaningful. At the same time, I turned my attention to the family business. With Eric out, I had more control than ever, and I wasn't about to waste it. I started making changes, streamlining processes, cutting dead weight, and bringing in fresh talent. It wasn't just about making the company stronger, it was about erasing the legacy of Eric's mismanagement. But Eric wasn't going down without a fight. He started showing up at the office, lurking in the lobby or near the parking lot. Once, he cornered me as I was leaving work. "Enjoying yourself?" he sneered, leaning against my car. "Taking everything from me? Does it make you feel powerful, Joe?" I unlocked the car and opened the door, ignoring him. But he wasn't done. "You think you've won, don't you?" he said, stepping closer. "But you haven't. You're just as much of a fraud as I am. The only difference is, I'm honest about it." I turned to face him, keeping my voice calm. "Honest? Is that what you call sleeping with my wife and stealing from the company? You're a joke, Eric. And everyone knows it now." His smirk faltered for just a second before he recovered. "You're pathetic, Joe. You've spent your whole life trying to prove you're better than me, but deep down, you know you're not." I didn't bother responding. I just got in the car and drove away. Let him stew in his delusions. At home, or rather at the hotel, Sam and I were finding a rhythm. He started going to therapy, and while he didn't talk about it much, I could see small changes. He was more present, less withdrawn. One night, we even stayed up late watching old home videos on my laptop. For a few hours, it felt almost normal. But the hardest part was still ahead, cutting ties with my parents. It wasn't something I wanted to do, but I couldn't keep pretending they hadn't been complicit in all of this. Their excuses, their justifications, it was all meaningless. They'd made their choice, and now I had to make mine. I met them at their house, the same house I'd grown up in. My mother opened the door, her face lighting up when she saw me. "Joe," she said, reaching for a hug. But I stepped back, and her smile faltered. "We need to talk," I said. My father was in the living room, reading the paper like it was any other day. When I walked in, he set it down, his expression unreadable. My mother sat next to him, wringing her hands. "I'm done," I said, cutting straight to the point. "I'm done pretending we're a family. You betrayed me, and you've done nothing but make excuses for it." My mother's eyes filled with tears. "Joe, please. We thought we were doing what was best for you. We never meant to hurt you." "But you did," I said, my voice steady. "You hurt me. You hurt Sam. And for what? To keep the Tyndall bloodline alive? Do you even hear how insane that sounds?" My father cleared his throat, his voice gruff. "We made a mistake. We admit that. But you're taking this too far, Joe. Family is family." "No," I said firmly. "Family is trust, respect, loyalty. You threw all of that away. And now, you're reaping the consequences." My mother started crying, but I didn't waver. I stood there, letting the silence stretch out before finally saying, "This is goodbye. Don't contact me. Don't contact Sam. We're done." I turned and walked out, ignoring their protests. As I got in my car, I felt a strange mix of emotions: sadness, anger, relief. But most of all, I felt free. That night, I told Sam what I'd done. He didn't say much, just nodded and gave me a small, tired smile. I think he understood in a way only he could. We were both starting over, and while it wasn't going to be easy, it was the only path forward. The past was behind us now. All that mattered was what came next. Cutting off my parents felt like ripping out a piece of myself, but once it was done, I felt lighter. I was done chasing approval from people who had never valued me enough to give me the truth. Sam and I were all that mattered now, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. Eric, however, wasn't letting go so easily. He showed up unannounced at my hotel, banging on my door like a lunatic. When I opened it, he was red-faced and furious. "You think this is over, Joe," he spat. "You can't just erase me." I crossed my arms, blocking the doorway. "You erased yourself, Eric. You had every chance to do the right thing, and you blew it. Now leave before I call security." He laughed bitterly. "You're going to regret this. You'll see." I slammed the door in his face. Whatever he thought he could do, I wasn't worried. He had nothing left to use against me. Later that week, the divorce process began to pick up speed. Carol tried to play nice, sending messages about how she wanted to make things amicable, but I wasn't in the mood to indulge her fantasies. My lawyer ensured I had the upper hand, and I made it clear that I wouldn't compromise when it came to protecting Sam. Sam, meanwhile, was starting to find his footing again. Therapy was helping, and he even mentioned wanting to go back to school soon. One night, over dinner, he said, "You know, I think we're going to be okay." I smiled at him, my chest tightening. Yeah, we are. For the first time in a long time, I believed it. The worst was behind us, or so I thought. But I'd learned soon enough that Eric wasn't done trying to tear me down. Just when I thought Eric had finally slinked away into whatever hole he crawled out of, he proved me wrong. A week after his meltdown at my hotel, I got a call from our legal team. Apparently, Eric had filed a lawsuit against the company, claiming wrongful termination. I wasn't surprised. This was Eric's style. When he couldn't manipulate his way out of trouble, he tried to turn himself into the victim. The irony was almost funny. He'd embezzled money, lied to the board, and jeopardized the company's reputation, yet he somehow convinced himself he was the one who'd been wronged. The lawsuit wasn't just a nuisance. It was a clear sign Eric wanted to drag me down with him. His claims included vague accusations that I'd sabotaged him, which was laughable but still something the board had to take seriously. I spent hours with our lawyers preparing for the case. It was exhausting, but part of me was glad for the distraction. The anger I felt every time Eric's name came up was a fire I could use, something to keep me moving forward instead of dwelling on everything else. Sam noticed something was off, though. One night, while we were eating dinner, he asked, "Is Eric causing more trouble?" I looked up from my plate, surprised. "What makes you say that?" He shrugged, poking at his food. "You get that look on your face when you're stressed. Like you're trying not to punch something." I laughed despite myself. "You're not wrong. Eric's filed a lawsuit against the company, but it's nothing for you to worry about." Sam frowned, setting his fork down. "Why can't he just leave us alone?" "That's just who he is," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "But don't worry. I'll handle it." The thing about Eric, though, is that he never knows when to stop. A few days later, I got an email from him, of all things. The subject line read, "We need to talk." I debated deleting it, but curiosity got the better of me. Inside was a long rambling message about how the family was falling apart and how I was destroying everything. He claimed he only did what he did because my parents pressured him, and that we should let bygones be bygones for the sake of the family. It was so absurd, I actually laughed. Eric thought we could slap a band-aid over 17 years of betrayal and act like nothing happened? It was just another ploy to save himself. I didn't respond. Instead, I forwarded the email to my lawyer, adding a note, "Let's make sure he doesn't have any leverage in this lawsuit. I'm done playing games." Eric wanted to drag me back into his chaos, but I wasn't going to let him. He'd already taken enough from me. Now, it was his turn to lose.